now have Anshula Chowdhury talk to us. She's the CEO of Social Asset Measurements. SAM provides the Social Return Intelligence Suite software, which provides social return on investment and impact reporting. She's also the co-founder and board member of Youth Social Innovation Capital Fund, which was the first by youth for youth professional impact investing fund in Canada. Her experiences span the non-profit and for-profit in countries such as Jamaica and India. She is the recognized expert in the field and has spoken in various universities, conferences throughout Canada, the States, Europe. Anshula has also worked with a San Francisco capital market software company. Her contribution assisted in commercialization in USA. But seriously, she is the leading expert on the subject in the city of Toronto. Please help me welcome Anshula Chowdhury.
I'm going to stand to the side of this thing so you can actually see me, because being 5'2" is not confusing. I actually wanted to start with a video. I know I have a set of slides, but the video I'm going to show you is actually a set of interviews that Sam did with our clients. And the reason I want to show this to you is because oftentimes when we have measurement professionals come up and speak, it's from a place of, I really understand what I'm doing, and this is social return on investment, this is the methodology. I want to show the flip side of that, which is kind of the end user, and Sarana will actually be talking in a great deal of depth about that. But just to give you a sense of how widespread impact measurement is, and to just lend it a little bit of meat in terms of the end user experience. So bear with me while there needs to be a fundamental shift in the way that the economy currently operates. Consumers are now looking at brands and saying, does this brand represent a better world, whether or not we're making happy workers, healthier, more vibrant communities? That isn't encapsulated in a profit and loss statement.
Our mentoring program is really what makes us different from other lending institutions. One of the things that Sam pointed out to us, that the mentors themselves get value out of being mentors, and that you can quantify that. That's an unexpected benefit of this project. We hadn't really thought about it that way.
Whether we be a nonprofit or a charity or a for-profit, what SROI does is it makes the value of a company in all of its breadth completely tangible.
We specialize in helping organizations measure their social value, so assessing the activities and outcomes and indicators associated with your organization.
Use our web application solutions to provide an SROI across an organization and have it instantly available.
We help them build the tools needed to measure their social value and develop the frameworks of analysis for them.
Working with Sam has given us an opportunity to really push through some cutting-edge thinking around evaluation, around assessment, and around evaluating impact in a really creative way that's allowing us to be a leader in our field and prove our value to our members and to the outside world.
SAM is great because they take a real grassroots approach when they work with you. A lot of consulting firms will sort of take the information you give them, go away, and come back with an SRO calculation. SAM doesn't do that. They work one-on-one with the projects that we fund to help develop an SRO template that fits their criteria.
What's exciting about this space and this work is that what we're doing is re-envisioning what's valuable. So now that all of you have seen my face in about 10 times that size, so the reason, one of the things that we found with impact measurement in the last couple of years, and we are a fairly new firm, is that when we talk about impact measurement for just nonprofits or just social businesses, we're actually limiting the conversation. The dialogue that's happening in the field now is about really enlarging what we value and how we value it. And so when we talk about the work of social return on investment, you see a lot of numbers and you see a lot of Excel spreadsheets, and sometimes we lose sight of the fact that this is in many ways an evolution of how society is looking at what it's doing. So I did want to talk to you a little bit about SAM, not too much about that, but also generally about the methodology of social return on investment. SROI is just one of many methodologies that are out there, and Bill mentioned sustainable livelihoods as an example. The reason I want to talk about SROI is, for now, it is kind of the leading methodology, and it provides a very powerful way of speaking to various stakeholders. So when you do a social return on investment calculation, by the end of it, you should be able to say, for every dollar that's gone into a program, we're able to create X dollars of impact, right? And so that speaks very well to impact investors, but what we're also finding is that program managers and organizations are able to align with their stakeholders and present a vision of value that speaks to them as well. I also want to talk a little bit about how SAM provides products in the market and some of the reasons as to why we decided to do that. I also have questions at the bottom. I'm completely okay with you kind of popping your hand up and asking a question on a particular slide. I think that's actually better because we can look at the context and it makes for a better conversation. So feel free to jump in with any comments or questions that you have. So SAM's been around for the last couple of years. We provide a suite of software and consulting services. We've been lucky enough to work with some fairly large organizations. The Ontario Trillium Foundation being one example, the Canadian Youth Business Foundation, as you saw from the video, as well as the Ontario Centres of Excellence. We received National Research Council funding for some of our software products, including the Sabida database service, which is the largest database of indicators and financial proxies in the sector. I'll explain what a financial proxy is in further detail later on in this presentation.
Do you mean IRAP when you say it?
Yes, IRAP.
Thanks.
And so a financial proxy, just briefly, is a dollar amount that helps you value change. So if you say that you've given someone employment, what does that mean in terms of dollar amounts of productivity to the economy? And you can start looking at the salary that a person has provided or has been able to gain for themselves, as well as tax revenues to the government, amongst other things. We also provide the IRA impact reporting and management software, which essentially collects data and then provides ongoing social return on investment reporting. It's essentially like a accounting software, but specifically for impact. So, like any social enterprise, we do have a theory of change. This is obviously a very simplified version of it. But I wanted to speak a little bit to how we work with clients. And I would guess that many consulting firms that work in this field would have something similar. Probably the minutiae would be different, but just in terms of a general approach to how we work with clients. If you look at the bottom of this triangle, you'll see scoping written around the bottom. This is generally where we start working with clients. And so when they come to us, they'd like to be able to measure their impact and make that social return on investment statement. The difficulty, though, is actually collecting the data, and Bill spoke a little bit to this as well, but collecting the data, understanding what's coming out of it, is a big challenge for organizations. So we start from the very beginning of selecting those indicators and financial proxies, and then creating a system and a process for people to collect their data. Once we've done that, we also provide the capability to actually put data into a system, so whether that's through software or generally in kind of the first run of when we work with clients, they send us surveys and we kind of go through things with them. Once we have actual data, in terms of outcomes data, we move on to being able to understand what the impact is telling us. So specifically, we're looking for areas of successes and challenges. So when an organization says we are really good at X, Y, and Z, we come back to them and say, well, you're pretty good at X. You might not be as good at Y as you think you are. And Z is something that you definitely need to work on. It changes the discussion that organizations are having from something that is qualitative to something where there are numbers behind it. The next stage is actually being able to optimize impact. And so this goes back to what Bill was saying around managing the impact of an organization. If you're measuring without the intent of management, then it's probably not worth your time to go down this road, because it is it's kind of like having your own accounting statements and never looking at them for any other purpose than to tell someone what your revenues are. You're kind of missing the vast majority of the value of that work. So the methodology that we go through, and this is generally, it kind of happens in the tracking aspect of our work and our theory of change. We use a methodology that was actually provided by the SROI network. And the SROI network is a global body that comes up with principles and approaches to impact measurement. The 6 steps that you see listed are directly from what they've provided. If you want more information on that, I would also suggest you can either go onto the SAM website, but kind of a more fulsome textbook for this is the SROI guide, which is provided by the New Economics Foundation and was created in partnership with the UK government. However, to speak briefly to this, the 6 steps that you see in front of you are applied to any program, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, but the specifics of exactly what you're measuring depends on the social context. So to start from the leftmost box, which says to set scope, you'll notice that that has very similar terminology to the triangle that I was talking about earlier. However, setting scope in this context is a purely methodological question. So which stakeholders are you going to involve in your measurement? And stakeholders are groups of people that are being impacted by your work, not just the firm, but also participant groups, funders, and people who are related to them. During this stage, one of the major things that we find is people suffer from what we like to call stakeholder creep. Stakeholder creep is when you have a list of 20 stakeholders that you believe all 20 of them are important. That's not to say that all 20 of those stakeholders might not be impacted by what you do. So to give you an example, sometimes we have people say, we provide employment to a particular marginalized group, and their families are also impacted by this, as well as their neighbors, as well as their parents in another country, as well as their third cousin twice removed on their father's side. It gets pretty large, and so the point that we're trying to make is to keep the analysis as actually material. So going back to what the program actually wants to do, is it within the interests of the program to help your third cousin twice removed in a different country, or do you really want to stay focused on that particular participant group? So once you've come up with a statement of what's material, you can move on to the next step of mapping those outcomes. So mapping outcomes is really just coming up with a description of what's changed, and that can be both positive and negative. One of the major things that organizations sometimes forget is that we can have unintended negative consequences for the work that we do. So if you're working with a stakeholder group that happens to require transportation to get to your programs, but they're a low-income group, they're taking time off work potentially to go there. They're also taking on the cost of the transportation. That could be a negative consequence, and so it has to be included in the analysis. Without that, the social return on investment assessment is not considered credible. Are there any questions up until this point? So, I just want to take a step back. What we've done up to this point is started to, in an abstract way, enlarge our vision of value. So, generally, when we look at value, we're looking at internal to an organization. What are the profits and losses? What are the revenues of an organization? We're now saying, that's great, we have excellent standards for that. Let's enlarge that and say, who are we impacting outside of those general approaches? So we've identified who we're affecting and how we're affecting them. And now the next step of evidencing those outcomes is making that change measurable. So that's actually coming up with indicators. These have to be measurable, they have to be specific, and they have to be something that is verifiable. So coming up with those indicators is a major step for organizations, because it's one of the times when they start to realize that measuring outcomes is very different from measuring activities. So when you measure an outcome, you're saying who benefited from this program and how did they benefit. When you measure activities, you're saying what did you do with your money. Two very different statements, and it's important to differentiate between them. The next step of giving them a value, and I like to say that this is kind of snuck in at the bottom because it's part of the third step, but it's actually one of the more complicated areas, and this is really where we talk about financial proxies. So, to go back to the example I was talking about earlier, if you provide employment opportunities, and you'd like to look at the number of people with full-time employment who work more than 37.5 hours per week, that's an indicator, it's specific, it's verifiable. But giving them a value, giving a financial proxy, is looking at the dollar amount of salary as well as the dollar amount of government tax revenues that might come out of that. Those are just two examples. So I should just take a step back here for a moment and say that when you talk about attaching financial proxies in a social return on investment statement, it's not always possible to value all of the indicators that you believe are measures of success. And I'll explain some of our thinking around that. This is a slight departure from SROI as it's taught by the SROI network. We sometimes measure and use indicators that don't have a financial proxy attached to them. Are there any questions about that piece?
Can you give an example?
Yes, and then I will get to your question. So an example might be so when we're measuring a microfinance program, this was providing financing opportunities to new immigrants. And so one of the areas that the microfinance program identified, as well as the stakeholders that we interviewed, was that they were able to find more social support by being through this program. They were actually able to connect with other people. And so one of the indicators they wanted to look at was the number of new friends that they received through the program. That's not in kind of like an ultimate saving the government tons of money, and yet when you look at social seclusion, that is actually a pretty important indicator, at least in my mind and in the mind of the program. So we used that indicator and tracked it, but it didn't go into the social return on investment ratio. There's another question.
It's probably fairly similar. I just wanted to give an example of something which is sort of harder to calculate. I was thinking financial literacy or something, but it's easy with jobs to sort of say dollars created. What are some of the tougher ones you've looked at, and how do you calculate those?
Yeah, so one of the other areas is looking at healthcare costs. So when, an example would be a homelessness program. So if people are on the street, they tend to use certain services. So they might use rehabilitation services, emergency medical services. Those all have dollar costs associated with them. So you would actually look at the reduction of those service usage over time. So you might look at 6 months previous and then 6 months post as well. So there are some things that are simply not monetizable, but really you're looking for those hard dollar amounts that can be attached. It is actually so I don't want to get too into it because I could talk about this for like days, but I would say that there's a scale in terms of the hard measurability. So healthcare costs, very measurable, very hard in the sense that you can look at healthcare reports and Health Canada. I actually saw a very interesting proxy which was looking at the value of a professional network edition. And the proxy that we used there was actually $4.95, which, where did we get that number from? That was actually from LinkedIn's, that's how much you pay for an introduction to a professional network, which was kind of interesting, and we debated it. And the reason that we ended up using it was because LinkedIn had come up with the willingness to pay for an additional professional contact. So in that vein, if we're attaching a proxy for the type of change that's being created, you could make an argument that the LinkedIn dollar amount is a good proxy for an additional contact. So there is a range, and it's very much an issue that needs to be clearly laid out in a report. It has to be transparent, because someone else looking at that might not agree for very valid reasons.
A good figure to use might be a membership fee to a networking organization.
Yeah, so you want to look at the context, but the thing with LinkedIn is that it has millions of users, so that willingness to pay was, like the supply and demand forces were there, versus just like a membership organization, even if it has thousands, it's nowhere near the same. So that was our reason behind it. But it is an incredibly interesting discussion, and I don't know I know Bill was saying if you have insomnia, you should look into this, but I actually find it really interesting anyways. So I would highly recommend that you look into that literature. Yes?
So you mentioned one level of interaction. Can you go 2 levels, like twice out to get some kind of value out of this? So rather than a hard value
Yeah.
or a equivalent value, as you said,
Yeah.
would you go like a third order, and how much impact would that have? Or have you had a case like that?
Are you talking about like the macro indicators, or can you give an example of what exactly, like an example of what you want to measure?
Like you just mentioned about the value of the relationship
Yeah.
through LinkedIn, which
Yeah.
is the first order estimation. Have you done anything with the second order things?
Well, it's really more a method of valuation, right? So we're looking at willingness to pay, and then so one is willingness to pay, which is like LinkedIn.
That's direct.
Oh, I see what you mean. You can look at indirect costs. So to go back to Bill's presentation, he was talking about economic multipliers, which was the second order. It's a lot harder to measure, and that's because a lot of the times the programs that we're looking at don't have very large population sizes, so it's hard to inference that. In the cases where that's been attempted, you'd have to look at the sector categories that are created by StatsCan. And if you don't collect that information from the beginning, it's very hard to come up with a multiplier. And even if you did have it, you'd have to come up with a model for coming up with that multiplier. But it's fascinating. So once you've come up with the indicators and the financial proxies, the next step is to really start establishing your impact. So this is one of the key differentiators of social return on investment methodology. There's a big difference between saying 10 people went through our programs and 5 of them found jobs. And the alternative is saying 10 people went through our program, 5 of them found jobs, and 2 of them found jobs because of our program. So there's a link of causality that social return on investment attempts to create. It's not always credible to do so. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that. But in some cases, Sam has found that it's simply not possible. And so we have developed a model that looks at what is credible to establish impact for, and then provide alternative forms of reporting for other types of outcomes. Once you've established the impact of a particular intervention for that particular stakeholder group, you then calculate the social return on investment. The ironic thing is that most of the time when programs come to us and would like to work with us, we're really excited about calculating a social return on investment, which is for every dollar you get X dollars in return. But as you can see, the former 4 steps is actually where the majority of the work is. Once Sam realized this, we thought that we needed to find a way to recycle and be a little bit more efficient about how we're using the frameworks that were being created. And so that was really what led to the software creation, and I'll get into that. But essentially, once you calculate the social return on investment, you're supposed to embed and report. Generally, what we find is people are so sick of the whole process that they just don't end up embedding and reporting. And again, that's one of the areas that we felt that we could provide value in the market. Just really briefly before I move on, the social return on investment ratio that you see at the bottom is obviously a very simplified calculation. You would apply a net present value calculation as well. But I did want to point out that you can look at both the social and financial costs. So you can look at the dollar amounts that have gone into a program. One of the other things that we found, though, is a lot of programs rely on volunteer and in-kind donations, so you do have to value those things as well. Again, you're looking at the firm and saying, great, we have a good way of accounting for those costs. Now we're going to expand our understanding of what value is being created and also what costs are being incurred. Are there any other questions about this? Okay. I was giving a lecture at Seneca College, and I brought this slide up, and the student kind of looked really horrified, and I was like, oh no, like, is everything okay? And she's like, I hate math, I absolutely can't stand this. So if any of you don't like math, don't worry, this is very simple. And it's also kind of neat. So I wanted to provide an example of how a social return on investment statement works. What you'll see is 3 rows. On each row, there's listed an indicator and a financial proxy. So, for example, the first row says the number of participants with full-time employment. We have a financial proxy of $25,000. In this case, that is the salary that that person is receiving. To give some background on this particular framework, it is based on an actual client that we had. And in particular, we're working with young people who had high barriers to employment, and were receiving arts training in order to kind of provide them with resume building skills and those types of life skills. When we move further down, we have the number of participants with health benefits. So as part of this program, participants were placed in jobs as internships, and they would hopefully get hired afterwards. In some cases, the job placements were at startups, and so instead of getting a full-time salary, they might actually get a health benefits package, which is not ideal, but certainly a step up and an opportunity to gain further skills for further employment. You'll notice the financial proxy there is $2,000, which is a rough approximation of the value of health benefits packages that are provided by employers per year. The third indicator is the number of participants with an increase in quality of additional life year. That's an indicator that a lot of studies have used, particularly in epidemiology and health outcomes. You'll notice though that there is no financial proxy. Sometimes people do apply financial proxies to QALYs. We didn't, because we didn't feel that we could use the studies that had been done on this topic were on completely different demographics. So these tended to be professionals or people in developing countries. There was nothing for this particular demographic that we could use as a financial proxy for the productivity of one full life year. So we didn't use one. So once we've set up that framework, and this is really around evidencing outcomes and giving them a value, we then collected data. So we had 5 people who the participants were full-time employment, found full-time employment. 10 of them found an employment situation with health benefits. And 20 of them actually had filled out the form around QALYs. And we did a pre and post survey, so we found that 20 of them actually had like a significant increase in the quality of additional life here for them. You'll notice that we've summed up all of those indicators. So we have 125,000, 20,000, and then the total being $145,000. Are there any questions about this process so far? Yes.
A question about data collection. How do you determine the sample of your targeted questionnaire population, and how do you ensure quality of question itself, and how do you ensure the quality of analysis after the data?
Okay, so when we look at the sample size, there is currently no standard deviation on social return on investment amongst populations. So unless we get 100% or very close to 100% of a population, we can't make a representative statement. Your second question was around quality, like the questions. The questions are actually prepared by the SAM staff who have been trained in this. They have research methods training. In terms of the quality, so once the surveys are provided, we provide ongoing support to the organizations we work with to help them implement those data collection tools. We provide them with a schedule, etc. We have a support line, all that. However, the interesting part of that question is really around the quality assurance piece. So how do we know that the data coming in has quality assurance? We actually work to provide auditing capabilities to organizations. This is a newer area, so generally what's done in the field is you get an Excel spreadsheet and you look for outliers, and you might do a little bit of auditing, but it's certainly, I think it's a little bit more haphazard. What we started to do is take the tools that are available for mapping out your impact, and that's actually called a logic model or an impact map, and we started to insert capabilities for building in quality assurance procedures. So for example, we would say, here's the indicator, here's the question, this is the tool that you would use, and they have to provide us with information about how many people have actually answered that tool. We would then randomly select between 5 to 10% of that population and conduct an audit to see if the questions are correct. So it's an ongoing process in which we're building, but that's what our recommendations have been thus far. We do look at the capacity of the organization, though, and I'll get into what that looks like shortly, but I mean, in an ideal world, we'd be able to provide those auditing capabilities. Other questions? Everyone having fun? Okay, so I had mentioned about establishing impact as well. So confusingly for anyone who has studied economics, we look at deadweight, which has absolutely nothing to do with deadweight loss, but is actually counterfactual. So deadweight looks at what would have happened anyway. And so what we want to look at is how many people would have found full-time employment anyway, how many people would have had health benefits regardless, and how many people would have increased their quality of additional life here. So we have to set up the parameters of the analysis previous to actually collecting the data. Once we have the data, we can start ascertaining what the deadweight is. So in this case, we found that 2 people had actually found employment through their own family members, not through the program. So we took out $50,000. We also found that 6 people had already received health benefits through their previous job. They may have transitioned to a new one, but they already had access to those health benefits. We also found that 10 people were involved in other programs that may have had an impact on their quality of additional life year increase. And so to be conservative, we took those numbers out. Again, I've simplified this a little bit, but as these numbers are generally expressed as percentages. But what you end up with at the end is we have $145,000 in the second column as the total amount that was initially looked at. We're actually going to take away a significant portion of that, about $62,000 from the total benefit that we had originally calculated. If you look to the bottom of the slide, you'll see that $145,000 minus $62,000 will leave us with $83,000 of actual impact. We've assumed a cost of the program of $30,000, and so we're left with, for every dollar that's gone into this program, we've created $2.76 of impact for the surrounding community. So as we started building these indicator catalogs, we started building indicator catalogs with 500 indicators, and X number of financial proxies. And it felt a little bit wasteful because we would create one for the Common Foundation, and then we would create one for Ontario Trillium Foundation, and there was no way for them to really talk to each other and figure out what they were doing, and there's no standardization. So what we started to develop was the SABITA Indicator and Financial Proxy Database, and that was the piece of software that was developed with IRAP funding. SABITA allows organizations to browse everyone else's indicators and financial proxies and start using them. Every single time you upload a financial proxy into the system, it also provides a grading from 0 to 10. So if your financial proxy is something that references a blog post, it will actually be graded at a lower grade. The idea is that, one, over time that algorithm will become more sophisticated, but in addition, people are able to start looking at the quality of a financial proxy and create higher quality impact frameworks for the impact measurements work that they're doing. Once organizations have worked with SABITA, they're also able to use the IRA impact reporting software. So I mentioned that the other major problem that we had was that people would go through these frameworks, they would collect the data, they would come up with these reports, and then they'd completely forget everything that they've done. So what IRA does is it actually houses the indicators and financial proxies that have been selected for a particular program. And organizations are then able to log on and insert their data either through manual entry or as an Excel entry. Once that's completed, we're able to create impact reports as well as data summaries. So that includes social return on investments, unmonetized impact, outcomes, and outputs. One of the other neat things about about IRA is that it has unlimited user accounts. And the reason we did this was because some of our first clients would get these really fancy reports that we could send off to Kinko's to get printed, and then it would just sit on the shelf because it was just too difficult for them to send it out to everyone, even if they had a soft copy. It was just it was a bit too much work. So instead, what we've done is you can create unique logins, and so you can give that to your funders, to your program managers, to anyone that you like, and share only the pieces of information that you'd like to share with them. So funders, so for example, Ontario Centres of Excellence, was able to log in and look at the social return on investment that was created by their grantees. without revealing any of the confidential participant data that was also housed inside that software. So it's starting to create a more proactive communication strategy for what the impact of a particular organization is. It also allows for scaling, so if you know that a model works and you want to suddenly bring it across 5 different program areas, this is something that you'd then be able to do. The last piece that we found was, it's all well and good to say that the software will kind of help you repeat your measurement, but when we go back to the issue of capacity, if you're spending 10% of your organization's work on measurement, then there's probably something wrong, right? It has to be something that's scalable, and if we go back to the colliery of accounting frameworks, you set up your accounting framework once, and then you report within it, and the cost of keeping up an accounting framework decreases over time, right? You get better at it, you're more efficient. So we wanted to be able to do that with the software. So you create your framework once, and then you just report within it, and it decreases the cost dramatically. But what you're also able to do is reuse the indicators and financial proxies in other programs. And so the cost of expanding horizontally measurement across an organization is also being decreased, and it allows more users to be involved in the measurement of a program. Are there any questions about this? Yes.
So this is measured or theory?
Sorry?
This is measured or theory, the numbers you're showing us here?
Yeah, it's measured, but I've taken out the y-axis. Other questions? How are we doing for time?
We have another 10 minutes next.
Good. So are there any questions about the approach, about the methodology? I know I have focused on social return on investment and its associated methodologies, but I'm happy to, if possible, field other kind of methodological questions. Anything about qualitative measurement to answer as well. Yes?
Are there competitors in that software space?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, yes.
Is it a very crowded space now?
Not in Canada, but I think that's...
I'm thinking international.
Yeah. I was going to make a joke about the density of the population, but it didn't work out. But yeah, it is it's certainly a vibrant space. So there's Sam, in the Netherlands, there's a group called the Social Evaluator. They've been doing this work for, I think, 5 years. There's Social Solutions, CTK, Apricot. There's a whole, I think if you actually type in like impact measurement software solutions, you'll see a lot. Not all of them measure social return on investment. So currently the only 2 that do is SAM software as well as Social Evaluator. Social Evaluator, I believe, is more focused on practitioners, and what we've done is kind of take an approach of you don't have to be a practitioner to insert the data. But there's many softwares out there, and it really just depends on what your needs are, I think.
But how do you know, sorry,
Go ahead.
how do you know which one is better? Like, is there any governing body which rates them?
Well, you don't really rate software, right? Unless it's like a 5-star scale on like CNET or something. But so our software has been looked at for compliance by the SROI network. They went through all of our calculations. We're the first software in North America to receive that type of compliance measurement. But I'm sure that you'll see, like, you can become compliant with other people's standards if you wish to, right? So for example, our software takes an IRIS indicators, which is the, I always get this acronym wrong, it is the the Impact Rating International Standard, which was created by the Rockefeller Institution, actually. So there's a bunch of organizations trying to standardize, and you can always look at compliance with a particular methodology. But there's 2 different things. There's the taxonomy, so the list of indicators and financial proxies, or financial proxies sometimes being optional. And then there's the standardization of methodology. So the former is a bit more like you can put in whatever you want in terms of indicators. The latter is something where you'd actually have to look at compliance with a particular set of approaches. There's a couple. Sorry,
Yeah, I have read interesting news about countries that are happiest and countries that are not. How do they measure the happiness of country?
Happiness index.
Happiness index, yes. And don't you think that it should be a part of the study? And at least put a financial proxy on that as an indicator?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting discussion. I, as an impact analyst, can't tell you what to measure. Let me just explain that statement a little bit. So part of the reason that social impact measurement has been so difficult is because social value is based on whatever social context you happen to be in, right? So for example, a house built in urban Toronto would have a very different value than a house built in rural PEI, right? Just in terms of the value of that particular piece of property. So when we look at measurement and what we are choosing to measure, we have to look at the social context. In some cases, happiness might be an area that you want to look at. So as an impact analyst, or the impact analysts in our company, their job is to say, like, we understand that these are the outcomes that you'd like to create. These are some indicators that you can look at. If the organization doesn't identify happiness as an area that they would like to look at, then we can't force that on them. I think it's a very interesting measure and can have some financial proxies attached to it potentially. Don't quote me on that, but what you want to see is, are there outcomes that are being generated by people who have increased their happiness index or whatever? I don't know if that research exists.
I think in a company that where we have a very happy workers, I think the company is more productive. Don't you think so?
And that's a theory that you want to test through measurement.
Yes.
So I had a quick one on sweet spot. Like, is there a sweet spot for the measurement today, and where do you see the biggest uptake from the industry side?
In other words, your customers, I guess.
Well, yeah. So where do you see the biggest uptake, or where is it sort of more standardized, where people are saying, "Give me an index," or "Give me a number," or something?
I think the area where there is the most need for there's most demand for this type of standardization and being able to talk about the standard number. I think that's pervasive, to be honest. There is definitely a demand there. It is a very methodologically difficult thing to do credibly, but we're getting there.
But do you see much intake from CSR people?
Yes, absolutely.
I have the microphone, so I'll use it.
Yeah.
My question is, you said that it's a new field in a way, 30 years. Who is driving the change? So for the customers, is it more the organizations that are giving away the money? So, or the organizations that are grantees that are receiving the money?
That's a great question, and one that, traditionally it's been the funders, I think, who have said we need to measure. One of the things that's actually going on that's really exciting at SAM right now is we just launched something with Carleton University called the Canada Measures Initiative. And so what we found actually, particularly when we started creating Sabado, was that we had all these indicators and financial proxies from large foundations or larger organizations. And they weren't, that's one half of the conversation. There's an entirety of the grassroots, small nonprofit organizations that were not being involved in the discussion. And so we launched Canada Measures, which for organizations with revenues of less than $1 million, they can apply for the program. And it provides them with training, so a 3-webinar training program. Links them with an advisor who has, I believe the minimum is 5 years of impact measurement experience, and helps them create their own impact map, their own theory of change or logic model. And those indicators and financial proxies are inserted into Sabado, but those organizations are also able to start using the IRIS software and create their measurement. So once Rajas comes out, we'll have a set of data that actually speaks to the change that's been created on the grassroots. So I think organizations want to measure, and then for various reasons, sometimes because they're getting pressure from funders, but also because they want to manage their outcomes. It just hasn't been traditionally possible. So I think the conversation is just starting, I guess, in summary.
Just on qualitative measures, right? It kind of leads a little bit from the happiness question, but just around whether or not there's any qualitative measures. You mentioned just sort of in general of life, additional life years, but of quality of work experience, work environment, work, anything around people's sort of corporate life, I guess, whether or not there's...
Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't say that's a qualitative measure because you can still come up with a quantitative response to it. But whether or not you can attach a financial proxy is a whole other question. And there really is, I think, this is my opinion, obviously, but I think there's a divide between analysts who, or SROI analysts in particular, who believe that all outcomes need financial proxies, and others who believe that some outcomes don't need financial proxies. The one in the former camp would probably say that if you can't attach a financial proxy to it, then it's not a valuable outcome. And you know, there's arguments, I think, for both sides. Yeah.
Bill mentioned there's a couple of different methodologies: IRIS, SIAA, social return on investment effort, B impact, etc. Can you just sort of talk a little bit about the difference between the different methodologies? And it sounds like you do mainly SROI. Why you pick that as opposed to any of the other methodologies?
Yeah. So again, I'm going to go back to the differentiation I said about the taxonomy, which is the list of indicators and financial proxies, and then the actual methodology. So IRIS is a taxonomy. I get it wrong again, but the Impact Rating International Standard. GIN, which sits on top of IRIS, is a methodology. So it gives you a rating at the end of the day on how well you've done. So it's really a fit to purpose question. And so I'll just briefly go through the ones that you mentioned. So IRIS is made for investors, and GIN is made for investors. B Corp sits on top of IRIS. So B Corp is a methodology that sits on top of the IRIS taxonomy. And it's really about certifying businesses that have a social purpose behind them. What you end up with in both of those cases, though, is not a return on investment statement, but rather a, is this adequate, right, to meet a certain standard. So, I'm just trying to think of how to break this down. So that's one of the major streams, and in the States, that's B Corp in particular has gained a lot of steam. Going to SROI, SROI is not incompatible with IRIS because SROI is a methodology that sits on top of the IRIS taxonomy. So leaving taxonomies out of it entirely, because you can kind of insert almost any taxonomy into any methodology. You have social return on investment, which is really for managing outcomes, and it speaks to a different, particular government intervention, I would argue. It speaks to that. B Corp is much more around certification, as is GIN. To an extent, it is talking about kind of creating an index almost. There's also the Dow Jones Sustainability Index that also is a market index. But then you also have sustainable livelihoods, which is creating a standard framework, but also has a standard taxonomy underneath it. So the fit to purpose right now is very much practitioner created. So for example, someone who, the B Corp decides how B Corp is used in a way, right? So like, and if I was doing SROI analysis, I would decide who to sell to. And I think it might actually be a little bit too early to answer your question, because what we're seeing is that people who use B Corp will sometimes go back and do the assessment more often than they need to, because they're seeing it as a management tool, and that's actually not how they originally had seen it, and yet this is a value that the users of the system are finding.
Well,